Conversations on race and policing began in response to the police killing of George Floyd on May 25th, 2020. In this partnership between CSU San Bernardino and the Brennan Center for Justice, we hope to engage in ongoing discussions related to the history and current context of race, policing, and criminal justice with guests from diverse academic fields and backgrounds.
Mr. Jason Mott, thank you again for joining us here this afternoon at California State University for the conversations on race and policing. I would like to toss to our professor of history and co-founder of this event, Dr. Jeremy Murray, to properly introduce you. So take it away, Jeremy.
Thank you, Rafiq. It's a real honor and a delight to briefly introduce Jason Mott. From his bio, best-selling author and National Book Award winner, Sir Walter Raleigh Award and for fiction winner, and Pushcart Prize nominee, NAACP Image Award nominee, Carnegie Medals for Excellence, and a long list nominee. Jason Mott has a BFA in fiction and an MFA in poetry, both from the University of North Carolina at Wilmington. His poetry and fiction has appeared in various literary journals. He's the author of 2 poetry collections, We Call This Thing Between Us Love and Hide Behind Me. He is the author of 4 novels, The Return, The Wonder of All Things, The Crossing, and the book we'll discuss more today, Hell of a Book. I want to actually, just in case nobody else reads it, I want to read the subtitle as well, if everybody has time. I love this subtitle of the book, and I just want to flag it here, Hell of a Book in the Tradition, or the altogether factual, wholly bona fide story of a big dreams, hard luck, American-made mad kid. This is really a delight to host you, Jason. This is a this is a cry in the car kind of a book. It's hilarious. It's devastating. Takes you apart, puts you back together again. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to toss back to Rafiq for moderated discussion and Q&A.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Jeremy. And again, Jason, thank you for joining us here today. Whoops, wrong button. I've never heard cry in the car kind of book, Jeremy. I just jotted that down. I'll have to.
That might just be me.
I'm more cry in the shower guy, but I'll keep that one in my pocket. Anyway, but Mr. Mott, Jason, thank you so much for taking the time to visit with us today. And before we get fully into you, thanks to everybody again who planned today's event and as importantly, who've sustained these important conversations since George Floyd's murder, made it clear that we as a country still had a long way to go toward true racial reckoning and addressing state-backed racial violence. Not coincidentally, that theme is omnipresent in Mr. Mott's latest novel, Hell of a Book, and it's going to be in part the focus of the conversation here today. Jason, as I told you before we went live, when Jeremy shot me an email and said, "Hey, we're bringing Jason Mott to campus to talk about to join the conversation on race and policing." I was delighted. He had no way of knowing that I had recently finished your novel, or a few months before had finished your novel, but I was thrilled. I have a lot to say about your book, but and I don't throw this around cavalierly, but I thought it was brilliant. And there are very few books that I kind of throw up into that category. So, here's why I read your book years after it was published. Just very quickly, for at least the last 10 years or so, I've developed a literary year-end tradition where at some point in December, I succumb to this irresistible impulse to review the best books of the year list. And I don't just go look at every list. I have a couple of lists, that I go to, New York Times, NPR, stuff like that I really go and then I fish through that list and I find books that might speak to some of my interests and some that are completely outside of my interests. And then, much to the chagrin of my wife, I drop about $1,000 on books at the end of each year. And then they sit on this to be read shelf in my office. And And like you, I'm sure I have a busy life, so I don't always have time to get through them all. But anyway, probably about 6 months ago, I looked up on my to read shelf which has those books, and I saw a hell of a book on the shelf, and I was like, oh yeah, well, I like the colors, and I didn't remember what it was about, and I just pulled it off the shelf, started reading it, and I couldn't put it down. I'm thrilled that I picked it up when I did, because number one, I think the novel truly lives up to its name. It is a hell of a book, an incredible work of fiction, and what I think to be a poignant commentary on so many facets of American life, not just race and policing, and not just race, but just so much about America. So thank you again for joining us today, and thank you for contributing this work to the canon of contemporary literature. Big round of applause in virtual space for Jason Mott, and hell of a book. So for folks in the audience, the idea here is that I'll ask a couple of questions, get to just to kick things off, but you are welcome to submit questions that you would like Mr. Mott to weigh in on, about his book, about his life, about whatever. He said anything goes. He's willing to talk about anything, running down hotel hallways and everything else, right? So, but I'd like to take my moderator's privilege and just begin with a couple of questions of my own, and in no particular order, if that's okay with you. And also, if there's anything you want to say by way of introduction, you're welcome to do that as well, Jason, or you can just wait to answer. It's up to you.
No, I think you guys did a wonderful job on the introductions. I'm really happy to be here today. And yes, any questions from the audience, from the chat, like please send me questions. We can talk about anything. I'm here to hang out, here to have a good conversation.
All right, awesome, awesome. Well. I'm gonna get started with so we have this thing on campus called a book salon, where a bunch of us just it's hosted by our library dean, Rebecca Lubas, and anybody can come and just kind of sit in, and we just talk about books. Usually there's a question, but there's always a question that to frame the conversation, but we just drift off into whatever it is that we want, and talk about whatever. And so, but when we heard you were coming, I said to the book salon folks, well, what questions would you like to ask Jason Mott? And so this is kind of the first question is one that kind of came from that conversation. In 2013, which seems like yesterday, but was 11 years ago, you did an interview with CNN called Five Questions, and it was about your first novel, The Returned. And they described it as his first novel hit shelves. Mott, who lives in rural North Carolina, says he's terrified and excited by his newfound fame. And so my question is, if you knew in college or where you started out that this would be your job, and it would be your job in the way that it is it what you expected it to be?
It's a good question. I would say that it's definitely not what I expected it to be, but I would also say that I never expected it to turn out the way it did. If I had a time machine, I went back in time and I talked to my college self or my younger self and said, "Hey, one day this is where you're going to wind up." I wouldn't believe it. I would totally just not believe myself. So no, it's not it's not the way that I thought it would turn out. In both positive and like less positive ways. I think on the positive front, I've loved writing since I was 14. It's a thing that I've always wanted to do as far back as I can remember. So I'm extremely privileged and excited, and I feel happy every single day that I get to be an author and have a collection of novels and poetry and works out, and to do the thing that I've always wanted to do. I think that in and of itself kind of offsets any negatives that there could be. The other side of it is simply that I am still afraid of the attention that I often get. Like, I'm actually a very introverted person. I'm the guy at the party who never is just at the back of the room, quietly leaned up against the wall. I've always been that guy, from a kid to a young adult to now where I am now. And so learning to be more extroverted, learning to do interviews, learning to engage, learning to meet people, and actually learn to enjoy meeting people and learn to enjoy having these conversations. Like that has taken time. That's been really challenging. So yeah, I think that's been the hardest part, is just adapting my nature, my natural personality to what the job kind of required. That was just very interesting, very different.
Thank you for that. So I have a quick follow-up. You mentioned that you've been writing since you were 14. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
what were you, I mean, was that always something burning inside you? And I have a question about your process later, not your process, but
Sure.
what's going on next and things like that. But did you always know you wanted to be a writer? Were you always a gifted storyteller? Was your imagination? And I know the protagonist in the novel, the narrator, has a very vivid imagination, but what happened there?
So I was always a big reader. My mother, I have two sisters. My mother she was very adamant that we all become really big readers. So she used to take us and drop us off at the library while she went to Wilmington and did kind of errands and ran things. So we would stay there for hours. And eventually the librarian there, she would kind of have these kind of cultivated book lists that she would give us, where she knew what we all liked to read, my sister and I. So she would have these stacks of books waiting for us. So she would sit down and we would read. And that just became how summers went. So I was a huge reader, but I still didn't think that writing was something that someone like myself, who lived on a dirt road in a town of 600 people, could actually do. Then when I was around 14 or 15, I came across an excerpt from John Gardner's novel Grendel. It wasn't the entire novel, just a small excerpt, which was a retelling of the story of Beowulf from the monster's point of view. It's kind of a deconstruction of that story. And I knew the story of Beowulf. Like I had read it before, and I was a big fan of it. I really loved it. He was one of my favorite heroes at the time. And it was when I finished reading that excerpt, I went and read Grendel itself, and that novel turned the whole thing on its ear. And that's what made me want to write. The fact that it suddenly made me look at this thing that I thought I knew so well, the story of this hero and killing monsters. I knew that story so well, but after I read Grendel, I felt completely different about it. I was conflicted about it. I was confused about it. It just changed my outlook. And I remember telling to myself, like, I would love to do this to someone else one day. So that's when I kind of got the writing bug. Started writing short stories and eventually moved on to poetry. So that's kind of where it began. There was just that space of, coming across some piece of fiction that really moved me. I think that's a common story for a lot of people.
And so I know when you went to UNC Wilmington, that became ultimately what you majored in. Is that is that where you started though, or did you like you mentioned you enjoyed writing, you knew that you wanted to affect people in that same way, but
Mm-hmm.
kind of I'm wondering about like who taught you how
Oh
to do.
yeah, sure. So I started writing short stories and poems like 14 through about my early 20s. And then when I was around 21 or 22, my mother passed away very suddenly. At this point, I was writing, but I was not sending anything out. Like I didn't know how to submit to. I didn't know what journals were. I really just was just writing and sticking things in a drawer. And when my mother passed away, I felt that need to, that realization of how short life can be and how you need to follow the things that you want to do. So I quit my job. I enrolled in community college for 2 years. I went to UNCW for fiction. I went to my graduate program in poetry. So during that time is when I really began submitting to journals, submitting to magazines, began getting a lot of small publications, not novels or anything big like that, but just a lot of really small publications. So at community college, at undergrad, in graduate school, that is when I really met my writing mentors, the people that really shaped and honed a lot of my ability as a writer. The people who kind of taught me what writing really was, as opposed to what writing is kind of perceived as and kind of advertised as. I think we watch a lot of film and television, we read a lot of books about writers, and writing seems like this very like fireworks based thing where big things are happening and agents are making phone calls and books are selling off the shelves and you're just lightning strikes you and inspiration comes. You turn the whole book out in a week, and that's not the reality. The reality of writing is you're at your desk, 5-6 hours a day, and it's really boring. And there's no one there with you cheering you on, just you and the computer staring at each other for several hours a day for years. But I learned to find myself in that process. I learned to navigate my place in the world, I think, and my engagement with the world through putting words on the page, and it just became like therapy. And that's kind of how I just stuck with it. And that's where things really began to kind of move forward for me.
Again, completely going away from the questions that I had intended to ask you. I'm going to come
Sure.
back to those.
Let's do it.
But it's just inspirational. So, we're a university, and we're in the business of higher ed. And, one of my laments has been that, the humanities has been under siege for the past
Yes.
couple of decades. You mentioned that your undergraduate degree at UNC Wilmington was in fiction. Then you went on to graduate studies focusing on poetry. I would imagine at some point somebody said to you something along the lines of, you kind of answered what has happened, but someone said to you something along the lines of, "What are you going to do with that?" Right? Because while the movies might depict writing as a particular kind of career, the starving artist is not completely a false idea, right? So uh, how did you negotiate? And I have a question about other jobs later. So
Okay.
maybe I mentioned Verizon and some other things, but how did you negotiate that kind of tension, right? Where you need people go to school to get a job.
Right. Right.
Being a writer, an accomplished writer, is like being an actor. It's a one in a million kind of thing in a lot of ways. How did you navigate that?
Um, I think honestly for me, I wasn't in it for the job of writing. And I know that sounds kind of counterintuitive. Um, I just wrote because I couldn't go without writing. And I had learned that, years before. Like I wrote every single day, and it was when I have periods of time when I'm not able to write, like I get into a really negative headspace. Like I need to write. And so for me, the decision to go to school for writing was just something that I needed to do for my own kind of well-being and my own kind of place in the world. Because I realized that putting words on the page was how I navigated the world. Like making art is what made the world make sense to me.
Okay.
And so I very quickly came to understand the reality that, yeah, like the odds of earning a living at this, the odds of having any kind of like quote unquote success, whatever that means, at this were very slim and most likely would never happen. That's kind of how I said earlier. If you told college me or teenage me that this would be the end result, there's no way they would believe you. But I also just committed to the fact that even if I come out of here and I'm not able to become a full-time author, I'm not able to have whatever that success is that I'm looking for, and I wind up working some other job, then so be it. At least I can still write. At least I can have a short story published here or there. Hopefully one day have a novel published. And yeah, maybe publishing that novel won't take over and change my life and have pay all my bills, but it'll pay that emotional bill. It'll pay that psychic bill that I have, that artistic yearning that I have to say something and to have it be heard by someone else. To me, that was always the most important thing. And so, yeah, like the job part of it, my parents were, my father worked at a sawmill, a paper mill for 27 years of his life. So I always knew like I can find a day job. I'll work construction. I've worked all kinds of day jobs. So that part to me, that wasn't why I was there, even though obviously it would be a great dream. I was there to help myself with my art because that's something I needed. Not that my wallet needed it, something that I needed. So that's kind of why I was able to just kind of make do with that.
So you you mentioned your hometown. You mentioned your mom passing when you were young, relatively speaking, and I know the return, it seems, was based somewhat on kind of that part of your life, and also in Hell of a Book, there's, without giving anything away, there's this moment where the author returns to kind of a sleepy rural, North Carolina town. To what extent in your work does art imitate life, or vice versa?
It varies. I think with Hell of a Book, with the returns and Hell of a Book, those were very much centered around kind of my personal life. Hell of a Book in particular. Hell of a Book is pretty, if someone, I've had people qualify it as autofiction. I think that is a fair enough kind of description of it at times. It is a semi-memoir at the very least. So there is a whole lot of myself and a lot of my real life experiences and my real life struggles within that novel. But at the end of the day, I have a friend who's an artist. Like he draws, he does tattoos, he paints, and he'll tell you, every artist is a self-portrait. So everything you do is a self-portrait. And I totally agree with that when it comes to fiction as well, nonfiction, whatever it is. You're always putting some part of yourself on the page, some sliver of who you are is going onto the page. And so for me, with Hell of a Book in particular, there's larger parts of me on the page, and I'm wholeheartedly about that. Like, I wholeheartedly embrace that.
Yeah. I was reading. Whatever. I'm a fan of James Baldwin. I think as everyone is, right? So,
Yes.
but I was reading David Leeming's or biography of Baldwin a long time ago, and he mentioned that Baldwin preferred to be his own biographer and was referring to kind of what I think you were just saying, which is that both through his works of fiction, but also through his essays, he was if you read it not even that closely, but when you read it closely, you really are seeing a lens into who he was and his experiences. And so I'm glad that you noted that, because I think that a lot of people think that, you know, fiction has to be completely divorced from who you are as a person. So, so along those lines, with you know, kind of thinking of um, Baldwin's work and how you captured your own experiences in your stories. Uh, and forgive my ignorance here, but do you Baldwin wrote obviously monumental works of fiction, but also was prolific in terms of social commentary, political commentary, essays, and things like that in the nonfiction sense. Is that a space where you also kind of exercise your thoughts and your passions and your views?
Not right now. Like, it's odd. Like, I struggle with direct nonfiction pieces. I struggle with those types of criticism. Not that I don't struggle with reading them. I struggle with writing them. I love reading them. I love encountering them. I love people that can write in that space. But when I actually have tried, and I've tried multiple times in my life to do direct nonfiction and to really do those kind of critical essays, and my brain just won't let me. Kind of going back to, you know, how the author in Hell of a Book has that overactive imagination. I think I definitely have a fair amount of that in my own personal life, where when I have tried to do direct nonfiction and direct essays, they eventually devolved into some type of fiction. I just cannot find a way to keep them out of it. So I've just kind of learned to embrace it. I've learned to embrace the lane in which my creative voice has kind of has directed me. So that's the place where I kind of exist now, and I'm totally okay with that.
Well, I'm sure we appreciate what came out the other end from that too. So, and I love how, you know, because I think a lot of people like try to steer away from their own creativity and from that other voice
Right.
in their head and everything else. And I know, you know, again, without giving anything away, the narrator in Hell of a Book, you know, there's very much going on in his headspace, and oftentimes it's difficult to delineate what is real from what's imagined. But ultimately, that is what, you know, he attributes to his own creativity, and I think that. That ought to be licensed for folks. Hearing you say it, right, ought to be licensed for folks to really kind of let that guide how they, you know, do all of their or pursue their own creative passions, because, you know, I think the outlet's great. So I have
Sorry to interrupt very quick, just a
yeah.
quick point of order. Jason, I think there's a click that's happening. I don't know if your mic is on your
It is.
headphone.
Yes.
There's just a little bit of a click that's coming in and out. I just wanted to give a quick note on that.
Okay. I'll try to sit up more and maybe have it not click.
All right. Thank you, Jeremy. So again, to folks in the audience, feel free to submit. I see we have a couple of questions in the Q&A, and I'll get to those in a second. Feel free to submit questions into to the Q&A, so that and we'll be sure to save time for those questions. So my next question for you, I'll go back to my script now, and or at least my own curiosities, and so um, here's the job question. So in your National Book Award acceptance remarks, by the way, congratulations on the National Book Award for a hell of a book. You thanked your agent, and to quote you, who exactly 10 years ago this month picked me out of the slush pile, and who since that day has been constant and awe-inspiring in her love, support, and friendship. You've already mentioned that, you know, from the time you were 14, if not earlier, you had this author bubbling inside of you. And while you weren't necessarily viewing that as a way to pay the bills, I assume there was a point where writing didn't always pay the bills. And so my question is, what did you learn about yourself, about society, and about storytelling from your other jobs. You can mention Verizon Wireless if you want, but other jobs you had while you were, putting yourself through school or honing your craft as a writer. Like, what did you learn about you, society, and storytelling from those days?
Oh man, that's a big question. I learned a lot. Like I worked at Walmart, I worked at Bed Bath and Beyond, I worked at Verizon Wireless, I worked construction. Like I had a pretty broad scope of jobs, a lot of them in customer service. I learned that people treat you terribly in customer service, so try to be nice to people in customer service. That's one of the biggest things I've learned. Um, but I also learned that people want to be heard. I think Verizon taught me a lot of that. Like I was there for 4 years. We would just answering calls for people about their cell phone, and you'd be amazed at how often a cell phone bill question devolved into a very personal discussion about some part of their life. People that would call in angry and raging and screaming, if you give them 3 or 4 minutes to just express who they are and just vent, just let it out, they tend to kind of deflate and suddenly they want to engage with you and have a conversation. So I think one of the biggest thing I learned is that we all want to be heard. Like we all have voices that we feel deserve to be heard and need to be heard by other people. And we oftentimes don't get that in our lives. I know for me personally, that is why I pursued writing. And it's why I'm a fan of art, is because art is the place where I feel like my voice is most able to be heard and most able to express itself. But that may not be true for everyone. For other people, it could be other parts of their life. And so the desire to be heard and to be seen and recognized and acknowledged by other people, by our peers, by strangers, by our communities, by our countries, I think that is one of the biggest needs that we have as people. And I think that acknowledging that and really paying homage to that and really making avenues for that, such as colleges, and make sure that there are lanes available for people to find that way to express themselves and to be heard and to be seen. I think that's vitally important.
Thank you so much. I have other things about that, but Stan Futch has his hand up. So go ahead, Stan.
Well, thank you so much for being here. I really enjoyed the book. I'm almost done, almost done. But anyway, I wanted to say here we are 11 years later, and I found it 360 degrees. So the main character and talking to you is like a loop because you wrote a book and it's about your book and it continues to be a loop. So when I knew you were going to be here and I'm going to talk to you about your book, it's like, am I talking to the main character or am I talking to you? For me, it was a little confusing. I'm saying, I'm going to talk to that guy about. I was just it's so talk about that a little bit. How you did your interviews after the book came out and how the awards and so on. And I'm sure you did hundreds of interviews. How was that?
It was pretty fun actually. Like the funniest thing about that is, in the book, there's a lot of fun poked at the interviewing process and what it feels like to be on the other side of the interviewing process. So one thing that I found that was really hilarious is like I'd meet interviewers and they're like, "Hey, I read the book, but I don't know what to ask you now." Because in the book, you kind of you talk so much fun about how people always ask you the things you don't want to be asked or whatever. So for me, that was kind of the most fun part of it. But it was a great way to break the ice. It was a great way to kind of engage with people, but it's been really fun. Like it is surreal at times, even for myself. Like as much as the book plays with this author persona and plays with the which parts of it are Jason Mott, which parts of it are the fictional author, how much of it is actual biography, how much of it is autofiction. Um, it's created a really fun and different kind of experience where I am able to engage with conversations in a certain way and are able to expand outward from those kind of smaller conversations and really guide the kind of things into larger discussions. And so for me, it's been absolutely fun. It I think it helps with people who are unsure about interviewing process and unsure about how to engage in these kinds of conversations with authors, and it gives us something to laugh about. I think that's the best part about it. As much as the book is about seriousness and these topics that are very heavy and important, I also want to make sure that the book comes through with the comedy and the surrealism and the goofiness and the absurdity, because I think that's kind of how life is. Life is full of big, dramatic, serious moments that demand our attention, but then there's also very silly moments in our lives, and those moments deserve as much attention as the other big moments do as well sometimes.
And the last thing I wanted to ask you is what's your book about? Because that was part of the so this is a great conversation on race and policing. And in the book, there was several things that happened. Can you talk about your life and race and policing?
Yeah, very much so. And this is something that people who, if you have not read the book, this will, you'll come across this in the book. So this will be some backstory that you'll get before you encounter the book. If you have read the book, this may illuminate certain parts of the book that you come across. So I grew up in and still live in the small town of Bolton, North Carolina. When you read the book, that's the town that is mentioned, which is the town that I grew up in and still in, quite frankly. And when I was around 9 or 10, the mayor of my town, a man named Sidney Bowen, was coming home on a Friday night. He was pulled over by a police officer. Some type of scuffle, interaction, conflict ensued, and he was shot, I think, 6 times in front of his children, in front of his wife and daughter. And that is something that at the time, I remember that being a life-altering moment. Like, it was a demarcation line in how I viewed the world. Small towns, like the town that I live in and the town that I was growing up in, like, it was very much that small town persona. The front doors are left open. You can let your kids roam the neighborhood, and they're running into neighbors and cousins, and everyone knows everyone. Like, there's an air of safety, and I would see things on the news, and it felt very far away. Because again, I know everyone in this town. Bad things don't happen here, and strange things like that don't happen here. And then one day they did, and so not long after that, the NAACP came down. It actually made national headline news for quite a while, for a couple of weeks. It was a huge event. So at 10 years old, I was marching and protesting and all those kinds of things. And I remember after that event happened, I looked at the world in a very different light. I looked at my town through a very different lens. I looked at police officers through a very different perspective. When you're young, you think of the police as, oh man, the police is who you go to for safety, and that's their role. And I still believe that in my heart. I still believe that. But there are these incidences where, due to America's history with racism and a lot of the systemic nature of things, some components of that are different. And so for me, being in this town in this kind of small area, my personal life has influenced a lot of my writing. So with Hell of a Book, I wanted to really focus on that. Like, a lot of that came out of the Baltimore riots. I think it's 2013, 2014, Freddie Gray incident. I had a friend living in Baltimore at the time. He was up there when Baltimore was burning, and I would call him every day for about a week. And I was asking him, hey, are you okay? Are you safe? Is your family safe? And I would get these weekly updates for him about what was happening every single day from the ground level, like the protests, the riots, the National Guard, the police, all those terrifying and harrowing things that was happening. And as those conversations evolved, it became this discussion of, remember that last thing that happened? Remember Rodney King? And it just kept going farther and farther and farther back. And we both kind of began to realize that it had always been there, that these aren't new moments. They're not flare-ups. They're systemic. And I think that the tendency is always to think that these moments are just that. They're outbreaks. They're anomalies. They're one-offs. And the fact of the matter is, if you look at American history long enough, they're not anomalies. They are tradition, for lack of a better term. And all of those things kind of congealed together when it came time to, when I was working on Hell of a Book and exploring that, because I wanted to have a discussion about how in small towns it happens here as well. And if it can happen in small towns, then it does happen everywhere else. I think we get so accustomed to it happens in New York and Baltimore and Georgia, Atlanta, LA, these big metropolitan areas, that we forget that, no, this is nationwide. This is something that we all have to deal with and discuss and find a solution to, more importantly, a permanent, long-standing solution.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So that you kind of answered some of this, but one of our audience members, Ashley Flores from Sociology 5490, wants to know where she asks, where do you get the ideas for your fiction? Is it from your personal life or the lives of those around you? And you just spoke to some of that, but if you could just say a little bit more about your inspirations and the ideas for your fiction.
Yeah, for sure. Most of my fiction just kind of comes from, it's a mixture of all of those things. It is personal experience. It is the experience of friends and family. My friends know, like I've told them, anything you say or do will be used in a novel at some point. And so they always have to live with that. their most embarrassing moments have been funneled into novels and short stories and poems throughout my life, and they're all okay with it, which is good. Nobody sued me yet, so I'm happy about that. But it comes from that. It comes from conversations, late night conversations. It comes from news reports. It comes from watching television, ingesting art, reading books. So there is no one specific place. I think, if anything, it just comes from exploring the idea. I think oftentimes we see something and we ponder it for, a few minutes, maybe an hour or so, and then we move on. We go on with the rest of life and we do other things. And for me, when I see something that catches my attention, that my brain says, hey, let's think about this for a little while, I'll spend a day or two just writing about it, really trying to explore my thoughts on the subject. And sometimes that means journaling. Sometimes that means giving that situation to a character and seeing what the character does with that headline, with that situation, with that moment that I heard about happening to someone else. That's where a lot of my stories come from. I think it's just, I settle with the idea and with those moments a lot longer than I think most people do. And I try to give that moment broader breath, more room to breathe. And I think that's where a lot of my ideas come from.
Thank you so much for that. And it does remind me also of your book, where you kind of talk about just kind of the temporary nature of interactions and things along those lines. And about there was a line you said, everyone's just an image on a screen somewhere, but you're talking about kind of like short attention spans and us not really sitting with ideas for a long time. So I appreciate that. We have another question from Win Bab, who writes, I appreciate the genuine and compassionate responses thus far, particularly the idea that artists create self-portraits. That's a wonderful way of putting it. I'm curious what your favorite part or the most fulfilling part of the writing process is. For example, brainstorming, drafting, revising, etc.
Um, so for me, I have a tumultuous relationship with my writing. Ideas always begin as like the most exciting, amazing, interesting idea that I have. And the beginning part, the beginning part of the process is really exciting and thrilling. But then, a few months in or a year into a novel, it becomes a slog. It becomes the worst thing ever I'm doing with my life. And I totally doubt myself. And I'm like, why am I doing this? There's 1,000 other things I could be doing with my time right now. I could be just anything would be better than this. So I pushed through those. But honestly, the most fulfilling part, and I know in the book there's a lot of poking fun at interviews and things like that. But the most fulfilling part is honestly just meeting readers who have read the things that I've written. And it doesn't really matter what the thing is, because writing is very odd in that you don't, in a lot of ways, you are casting things into the void. Like you're putting your passion into these pages. You're spending years working on these projects. And then if you're lucky enough to get them published, they just kind of go out into the world and you rarely meet the people that are actually engaging with them. And I remember when I talk about that John Gardner work, he passed before I was born, and when I was reading that, there are plenty of writers and artists and people that I deeply, deeply admire. People who, without them even knowing it, have redirected the trajectory of my life just by me encountering their art, completely changed the path that I was walking down. And it will be so amazing sometimes to meet that person and to just express to them the importance of what they made, because it's very easy as an artist to feel like you're just casting things to the void and nothing's ever sticking. You're not making any kind of headway against the storm. And so when I meet someone, at a book event or at a campus somewhere or even over Zoom, who the work really impacted them, and they have that opportunity that I oftentimes didn't have, to just say to someone, hey, I read your book, I loved it, it made me think about these things, and I appreciate that. That is an incredibly powerful moment for me, because I realized that I'm not just casting things into the void. There are people out there. They're not just screens. Like, there are human beings out there who are encountering things and who live lives and who struggle. And if I can write something that gives them any modicum of relief or any modicum of just whatever they need to kind of get through certain moments, I think that's really what I'm doing this for, because I've had so many other artists who have given me that drink of water in the desert to get through these harsh moments. So I love meeting people who have read work, even if you don't like it. If someone reads, if I meet someone, they read it and they're like, I didn't quite get it. Thanks for reading. Like, and I mean that sincerely. Like, I really do. Like, giving someone your time to read their work. Time is something you never get back. You can never make more of. So the fact that someone gave me the time just means a lot to me.
Awesome, awesome. Yeah, and I can relate to that in some ways as a professor, right? You
Yes.
that you run into somebody 10 years later who says,
Yes.
yeah. Michael, please go ahead.
Thank you, Jason, both for being here and for writing a truly wonderful book. I've always been a big fan of Kurt Vonnegut, and I hope you see this as great praise that I started feeling a lot of Vonnegut in your writing, and then came across a line about a third of the way into the book that made me think, okay, I'm not imagining this. This is real. But one of the things I loved about Vonnegut and I loved about your book is the ability to talk about tragic situations, but use humor in a way that makes it more human. And how difficult is that? I mean, that must be more magic than, but I'm sure as a writer, hard to hit that in exactly the right spot where you're not mocking the tragedy, but amplifying the humanity in it.
Yeah, I think that is one of the hardest moments. And that honestly, when I was writing Hell of a Book, I was really terrified. Before anyone read it, when it was just me and that book, before it had any readers or anything like that, I was really afraid that the humor would undercut the seriousness of the discussion that I wanted to have, because there are dozens of moments in that novel that are not meant to be laughed at. They are meant to be studied and pondered, and you're meant to weep, and you're meant to grieve, and you're meant to feel this certain type of pain. And then 5 pages later, you're meant to be laughing. And I was really worried sometimes that I wasn't able to balance that and wasn't able to do that. And so as far as how it's done, there's just a lot of practice has gone into it. And I have a lot of really good friends who read my work, who've been reading my work for years, and we're able to have really honest discussions with each other. I think just the art of having an honest discussion with anyone is kind of becoming a lost art, quite frankly, nowadays, where we just don't feel openness, and we don't feel the ability to express ourselves openly to even our friends sometimes. And so thankfully, when I was working on this, I would send sections to friends. I would, talk about it over dinner and talk about it over drinks, and just say, hey, like, honestly, like, what is this scene doing? Is this undercutting the seriousness of this? Is it making fun of it? Am I disrespecting these people who have kind of had these moments in their life? And I got a lot of genuine feedback about it. Thankfully have friends who will tell me to my face, yeah, this was a little bit too far. You need to dial this part back, because this does undercut a certain moment, or this does make fun of this type of thing. You shouldn't make that kind of joke here. Um, I think having people willing to and feeling safe enough to have an honest discussion is the thing that helps these types of books come into being. I couldn't do it by myself. It really is about having support structure around me.
Well, I think you did an excellent job. It's
Thank you.
really quite compelling. I've been looking for a Vonnegut substitute, and I think I found one.
Wow, that's high praise, as they say.
Yes, meant to be. Thank you.
Thank you.
So I'm going to ask this question that I have as a segue to another question, with someone from the audience here. But there's an historian by the name of Edward Baptiste who wrote this book, The Half Has Never Been Told. And there was a critique of his book where, or rather, there was a couple of really harsh critiques about his methodology and some of his extrapolations and things like that. But in response to that, Baptiste wrote that the magazine's critique revealed just how many white people remain reluctant to believe Black people about the experience of being Black. And so my question to you is, as you toured with this book, how has your depiction of the Black experience through this book been received by different audiences?
I think that's actually a somewhat accurate. Like there have been a lot of people who very much believe the experiences that the book is discussing and the things that I've had to discuss about the book. So I don't want to make it seem as though no one believes anything like that, because there's tons and tons and tons of people who very much do believe and who want to hear this discussion, have this discussion. But yes, I've also encountered people who they feel like, especially with the fact that it's under the fiction heading, They're like, oh, this part here you just must have made up. Like it could not have been that bad, and it couldn't have been this type of thing, and it couldn't have been that type of situation. And then sometimes I'm able to have conversations with them and say, no, like in some cases it was worse than that. In some cases, the reality, like I actually dialed back a lot of moments here and there along the way. So there are times when the reality was actually worse than that. And people will choose not to believe that. I think there's a certain amount of cognitive dissonance that people can endure, or some people can endure. And so when you present to them a reality that just distorts their own a little bit too much, they kind of shirk from that and they dial back from that. And I think that's on a larger scale, I think that's a lot of what America is struggling with and has been struggling with for quite some time. I think that the picture of America as land of the free, home of the brave, we're all equal, we're all helping each other, melting pot, like that is a beautiful story. That is a castle on a hill. It is a wonderful narrative. The reality is that no, we're a very tumultuous family, and we have been for a very dysfunctional family at times, and we have been since the inception. Some of us, never even chose to be family, but we're here now, and this is the family you got. You got to sort it out. And so as families oftentimes have family narratives of like, no, we're all fine. We always got along. And then you corner them late at night and it's like, oh yeah, cousin so-and-so was actually doing this the whole time. And you start to realize that no, the family has been struggling for quite some time. I think that happens on a social scale, on a larger scale. Like American society as a whole has that duality and that same kind of struggle where we want to believe that it is this ideal country where everyone is treated equal and meritocracy is the thing and all those things are real. But the reality of it simply is that no, like it is not an equal meritocracy. There are people who have head starts. There are people who are oppressed. There are people who are mistreated. There are injustices left, right, front, and center. And calling out those things does not mean that they are unfixable. I think that's where oftentimes people get worried. It's like when you take your car into the mechanics. Like, I don't want to go to the mechanics. You're gonna tell me a lot of things, and I can't deal with that right now. I think that's how a lot of people treat American society as a whole and American writers. They kind of feel like, well, just don't bring it up. Like maybe it's an issue, but don't even bring it. If you bring it up, then we have to do something about it. And it's like, yeah, that's exactly right. We have to do something about it. So I think the people who kind of shirk those moments and the people who shy away from those moments, they just don't want to. They don't feel like doing the work of fixing certain problems. And shame on them, honestly. But I think it's up to the rest of us. We have to kind of carry that weight and do the work that they don't sometimes want to do and make them become a part of that process, I think.
You remind me of an essay from James Baldwin, Many Thousands Gone, where he writes, the story of the Negro in America is the story of America, or more precisely, is the story of Americans. It's not a very pretty story. The story of a people is never very pretty. Right.
Yes.
And I think you capture that both in your response to my question, but also in hell of a book. And I think, the humor aspect of it allows some folks to kind of come in who otherwise might not be might be afraid to come in and kind of entertain some of the ideas that you're putting forth in the book. And that leads me to another question that one of our audience members asked, which is about audience. And essentially, for whom do you write? And what they ask is, do you focus on a particular audience? And if so, do you foresee yourself redirecting that focus toward a larger interest?
So I used to write with the audience in mind. Hell of a Book was probably the first book I've written in quite some time where I wasn't thinking about the audience. In fact, I was certain that it was going to fail as a book because I was like, I don't know what the audience is for this. So this is going to be a terrible book. No one's going to buy it. So I kind of had to relearn, and I've had plenty of mentors along the way who the first thing that a good writing mentor will tell you is don't write for the audience, write for yourself first. And then hopefully the audience will come find you and you'll resonate with people. And I kind of gotten away from that. And so with Hell of a Book, I was able to do that. Now, the asterisk to that is at a certain point, you do have to recognize that you have an audience. Like we don't write for ourselves, that we write because we hope someone else will encounter this. So we have to structure our language. We have to structure the entire story in a way that it will affect some other person. So there is always the audience to think of. But I do think trying to write for everyone, that's a lark. And I think we oftentimes feel like our projects and our stories and our art has to please everyone, and it doesn't. It should please us, and it should please a certain kind of audience that we think will resonate with things. Like when I write a book, I know there's some people who aren't going to like it, and I'm okay with that. And there's some people who are just going to never going to pick it up, or they're going to pick it up and close it 5 pages in. And I'm okay with that, because there are other people to whom this book hopefully will be very meaningful. And those are the people that I'm actually trying to reach and have a discussion with, because those are the people I think are open to having that discussion. You can't talk through a closed door. I try to write books for people who have the door cracked. That's my goal.
That's a great way to put it. Thank you. Stan, back to you.
Yeah, the first 11 years of my life I spent in England. And so when I got to America public school, I had to adjust to my blackness.
Hmm.
And you actually talk about that in the book. And I mean, the only time I had seen more than 20 black people together since I'd spent so much time in England was at lunchtime. There was a table, 2 or 3 tables full of black people, and I always thought there was a riot, because the only time I had seen that in England was they were showing the Watts riots. So I panicked. I ran to the principal's office and said, "There's a riot out there." And he came out and he looked and he goes, "They're just having lunch." And I was just, I mean, like I said, I had never seen that before. So to me, it was uh, my coming of age to the fact that I am black. I'm not an Englishman. I'm a black man. And then now, and I am American black man. So I had to come to grips with being black. Did you go through a time period? You talked about the tragedy of the mayor being shot. Did you come to a time when you embraced your blackness, or were more aware of your blackness?
Yeah, very much so. It was definitely around the time of the shooting, because my parents, I think, and this is something that the novel tries to discuss. Black parents, and not only black parents, but like a lot of minority parents, like I think all minority parents, like there's a point where you're trying to let your child have their idealism and that sense of everyone is equal and you just work hard and things will happen. And you want to let your child have that. You don't want to bring up the realities of the fact that skin color does change life. Skin color does affect the way that your journey through life happens. And so for me, my parents were pretty good for a long time about not really letting me not think about the race component. And I grew up in a very black high percentage town. I went to school with mostly black kids. And so it was, going to school and seeing a lot of other black faces was very normalized for me. And then the shooting happened of our mayor, and my father began having a lot more serious discussions with me about policing and about race and about American identity. And he used to keep these encyclopedias, these ebony encyclopedias, which talks about Black history. So I was able to learn a lot about Black history that I was never taught in school. So I think for me, that's around the time when I really began to understand what the Black identity was as it relates to the American identity. And that was a very transformative period for me. And then, of course, going to college, like I went to UNCW, which is predominantly white, like by a pretty wide margin. And so suddenly I was the only black student in class. And that was brand new for me, like all through elementary school, middle school, high school, like it was predominantly a black school. And then suddenly here I was in these colleges where I was the only black face, and sometimes in the entire building. And that was just kind of how it was. And so that also kind of created a lot of pondering and a lot of exploring and a lot of thinking about what my black identity meant and how it was perceived by both the local community and then the larger community later in life, i.e. the American community. So yeah, I think it's ever evolving. Even now that I am a National Book Award winning author and all these very kind of positive things, these exalted kind of rarefied air, which I'm very grateful for. My racial identity is also encountered differently. I go to reading events and book events, and oftentimes people think that, well, you're successful, so a lot of the struggles of being black don't really apply to you anymore. And it's like, no, police still eyeball me the same way they did then. Like, and again, and I'm not trying to like attack police and say that police are bad, because no, like there are tons and tons and tons of really good police officers out there. But from a systemic standpoint, the way that we instruct police officers, the way that police officers are taught to engage with minorities oftentimes, that's the part that needs to be worked on. And that's the part where the identity, your blackness never goes away. You can pretend that it doesn't, you pretend that it does, but it doesn't.
So that leads to, Jeremy, I'm going to come to you in just a second, if that's okay, because there was a question from Nicolia Rodrigo who are along the lines of what you just said, Jason. So she writes, "Sir, you mentioned that police racism is tradition. What do you believe are some of the consistent factors that establish these moments where they may create these police incidents?" And you just referred to training, things like that. But if you have any other thoughts on that, that'd be great.
Yeah, I think it stems from a lot of different places. It stems from a sociocultural standpoint, just a larger sociocultural standpoint, in that um, a lot of black and brown people are, they struggle with poverty. They struggle with wealth. Like, the largest part of American wealth is not held by black or brown people. And American culture as a whole does not like poor people. We don't like poverty. America does not like poverty. We do a lot of things to attack people who are struggling financially. We do a lot of things to say that they're too lazy, they're not smart enough. We say all these things about people who are struggling financially oftentimes because of systemic issues, because of issues regarding race and identity and all those types of things. And so that filters through to the policing. And then, of course, if you go back historically within the police, obviously it traces back to the slave catchers, which was a rough place to start a police force, but that's kind of how American policing essentially began, particularly in the South. And so a lot of those roots still support the tree, and those roots are very difficult. I remember in Baltimore around the time of the Freddie Gray incident, there were a lot of investigations done, and the police reports would already be filled in with black male. Like, there were, not suspect, it would be black male already filled in on police reports before the incidents were happened. That was just, they were so used to and so expectant to be arresting black males that it was just police policy to go ahead and fill it in as black male, and don't worry, you'll find him. And I think people underestimate just how much that influences your perspective and influences your approaching people of color, from police standpoint, and also from just a cultural, social standpoint. In the media for quite a long time, black people and black and brown people were not portrayed in the best way. They were oftentimes known as simply through their poverty or through violence. They were the criminals. They were the people getting arrested. They weren't known as, the wealthy. They weren't known as the artists. They weren't known as the spiritual people, or in a certain way. Like, there's a lot of that. We underestimate how much those large scale things that we take for granted really do change and affect our lens to which we see each other. And that's where the policing kind of feeds into as well. Like, the police can only be what society has taught it to be. And so we got to fix the societal part of things first, and then the policing will follow. But until we start trying to fix the societal elements of it, the policing, I think, probably won't change.
Thank you for that. And just really quickly, when you mentioned about the relationship we have with poverty, right? There's a passage in your book on page 113, if anybody's playing along at home, where you say, and you write, "And the longer you go in life, the more you worry about something being taken away from you, taken away, and you worry about going back to not having enough. We're all afraid of being at the bottom of life's shit shack. We're all afraid of being poor, being injured, helpless, handicapped, all the things that make us look at other people and say, how bad? Someone should be doing to help them. The thing we're most afraid of is being the them in that equation." And I think that connects nicely with what you were saying about how we structure even policing and what it's there to do, and that being symptomatic of society. So thank you for that. Jeremy, go ahead.
I think this builds a little bit on these last few comments here. But I wanted to flag just the one reason I said the subtitle was because you said a hard luck American made mad kid. And if anybody missed that in the dedication, it's for all the other mad kids. I think that there is really just a profound expansiveness to the narrative that was so powerful, and you make space even for the police officer, and these are things that can only be done in this mode. I think we talked before we started a little bit about nonfiction and laying it out in a nonfiction format. I don't think this level of expansiveness or this level of power and connection, I think, is possible in in another mode. I haven't seen it anyway. So more a comment than a question. But about the use, your use twice in the first in the front matter of this term, mad. I just wanted to flag that as the deep level of tenderness for this for the boy on the bus, and his parents and his encounter with them. So just a thank you for that.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
And Jason, do you? I know we're up against the hour. Do you have a few more minutes, or if
Yeah,
you have,
sure. I sure do. Yeah.
okay, great. I have a just is speaking of thank yous and things like that. One of the things I appreciate of the many things I appreciated about your book, you have this both in the text and then also in the acknowledgments. You have reference to loving blackness. And so toward the end of the book, again, without giving anything away for those that haven't finished reading it or read it, you write, laugh all you want, but I think learning to love yourself in a country where you're told that you're a plague on the economy, that you're nothing but a prisoner in the making, that your life can be taken away from you at any moment, and there's nothing you can do about it. Learning to love yourself in the middle of all of that, hell, that's a goddamn miracle. And then in the acknowledgments, you write, thank you to all of those who picked me up each time I fell down. Thank you to everyone who's ever learned to sing in a world that does not want to hear your voice. Lastly, a message to the black boy that was, you are beautiful. Be kind to yourself, even when this country is not. And the two people that both of those passages immediately brought to mind to me were Ta-Nehisi Coates and Between the World and Me, where essentially that's his message to his son in that book, but also Bell Hooks and her whole literature on loving blackness as a statement of resistance, and on the one hand as empowering, but on the other hand as something that can be dangerous. And so there's no real question here. I just wanted to say I appreciated that. If you had any thoughts on that, you're welcome to opine, but I could go back to one of our audience questions as well. But I did really appreciate that. I don't know if it was an intentional, I mean, if you intentionally were talking about blackness as resistance and loving your blackness as resistance, but
Yeah, no, there's definitely some of that there. Like it was, because learning to love who I am took me a lot of decades, quite frankly. I'm 46 now. I think I maybe truly started to learn to love who I am and love the blackness and the black experience probably in my early to mid 30s. It took just a lot of time of like pushing against what I was being told in books and literature and television and all those things, and kind of navigating that and fighting back against that took a lot of time. But now that I've kind of arrived to where I very much love who I am, and I love my culture, I love everything about the part I play in all of that. I think that's very important to me.
Well, thank you for that. And now I should say, these passages that I'm reading, it's funny because I didn't go back through the book and find passages. When I really love a book, I dog ear the pages, and at the end of it, I go back and type it all up of like the passages that really spoke to me. So
oh wow, that's great.
Reference sheet. So your book had that, and I don't do that for every book. Your book had that.
That's
effect.
awesome.
So I'm gonna go back to one more audience question, and then I'll wrap it up with a final question of mine, because that's my prerogative, dag nabbit. And this one is from well, if I could do two quick audience questions, if that's okay.
Yeah.
One is from Gabriel Carr, who says, I look forward to reading your book when I get the chance. I was wondering if you are familiar with Nathaniel West, and if you would say the humor in the book is similar to his satirical style.
I don't know that author's name, but I'm also very terrible with names in general. So off the top of my head, I don't know that author, but I would definitely look into that author though.
All right, thank you. And then the last audience question is, well, before I do that, Rebecca Lubas, Dean of our library, she said, thanks for the great book. I listened to the audiobook and did indeed cry in the car. So there you go, Jeremy. Tribute to that. And Rebecca did want me to ask about the scene running down the hall in the beginning, but I'm not gonna ask that question and ask whether that was really you. So from Will Bosch, You mentioned, Will Bosch writes, you mentioned the level of cognitive dissonance in some readers who were reading your take on the experience of being Black in America. Were there any moments during interviews, like on CNN, where you noticed someone with obvious cognitive dissonance in order to justify their worldview? Also, are there any political commentators you know of that have had this dissonance after reading your book?
Um, so I've run into it not too often in interviews and things like that. It's kind of that idea of like the home field advantage. Like oftentimes the people who have that cognitive dissonance, who don't agree with the book and don't agree with the subject matter and the points made in the book, they just don't invite you on, so you don't wind up going on that show. The away team doesn't invite you to come play at their stadium. So it oftentimes winds up being people that are at least open to the conversation, open to having it. Now there are people. I'm not going to name names though, because that's that's very rude. But yeah, I've definitely had conversations with people of note who won't go on, won't discuss it in public. We had one-on-one discussions about how they just don't agree with it. They just don't see it. They don't see America as racist. They don't see America as having a race problem. They don't see America. They feel like we fixed it all. They feel like when the Civil Rights Act went into effect, and with Martin Luther King and a handful of others, the people that they can name, like they feel like that fixed it. And ever since then, you know, it's just a matter of like learning to move forward, push forward, don't look back. And I've actually had someone say that directly: just push forward, don't look back. And I think that just comes from a very specific type of denial that just comes from a very amazing and limited view of how life happens. The idea that I'm 46 now. When I get injured, it lasts. I mean, I used to, you're a kid, you fall down, you get hurt, you pull something, it's healed up overnight. At a certain age, when things happen, like you just live with them. Like you're stuck with that thing now forever, and you just got to find a way to navigate around it. And the thing about systemic racism, the thing about the events that have occurred that have injured Black and brown people, indigenous peoples, is that no, like America hasn't even gotten to the point of deciding to have true, honest conversations about fixing these issues. It's like, oh, there are these injuries that happen that we kind of inflicted, but don't worry, just go forward, just push forward. So I think that is the danger right now, and I've definitely encountered that with a few people.
Thank you very much, and I can relate a lot to the getting older and getting injured, and just working around it metaphor, as my knees and feet and everything else are like, what?
Yep,
So,
exactly,
um,
exactly.
well, so here is the final question that I have for you. It's the question probably you could have anticipated in terms of what's next. But you said that you were writing Hell of a Book in your head for 10 years. And then also in Hell of a Book, you write, quote, but the words we say never seem to live up to the ones inside our head. And so my questions, these are actually two questions or three. Number one, did the novel come out the way you wanted it to? Did it live up to what was dancing around in your head for 10 years? And then the second question is the what's next question. Is there another project that you've been working on in your head or otherwise in the space cleared by Hell of a Book that's coming up next?
So first, it's interesting that you call that line out. I definitely want to. That is a line from Soundgarden. I'm a huge Chris Cornell fan, so I want to definitely give a shout out to Chris Cornell. He was an amazing singer, amazing songwriter. So any Soundgarden fans, I know you guys caught that line. But I think with Hell of a Book, I was able to finally say the thing that I've been trying so desperately to say for so long. The thing that I didn't even know I was trying to say, that was kind of lurking in the back of my brain for years and causing me a lot of turmoil, a lot of worry, a lot of sleepless nights of not even really being able to define the anxiety and the worry and the stress. Hell of a Book kind of gave me the structure I needed to have a discussion with myself about America, with myself, about the role that I play and the role that writing and art plays and all these different topics. So yeah, I'm very happy with how that book came out. It finally did fit what I had in my head. And it came out with a lot of trepidation and a lot of worry. As I said, like I really thought no one was going to read the book. I thought it was going to be an abject failure. My agent and I actually had a hard time finding a home for it in the beginning. Like a lot of people passed on it. And I was like, yep, that makes sense because it's a terrible book. No one's going to read it. And then you fast forward and, it's won awards. It's done amazing. It's definitely my most successful novel. So yeah, it came out to be the thing that I always wanted and wasn't really sure how to create. So I finally made that happen. And now going forward, I'm working on a new project now. I'm actually pretty close to having it wrapped up. I think I've just learned to trust my instincts a little bit more. I've learned to trust my voice. And I've also learned to kind of not pressure myself as much as I used to. I think I've learned to be kinder to myself. A lot of times people ask, well, your last book did all these huge things. There must be so much pressure on you for your next book to be equally big or even bigger. And I tell people, not really. It's like, I achieved things that I wanted with my last novel. Like, it's okay if I just hit the showers, and if the next book comes along and hopefully it'll find this readership. And I don't care if that's 10 people or 10 million people. I just want the book to find this readership, which is all I've ever wanted for anything that I've written. Is just to find the person that it connects with.
Well, if it's anything like hell of a book, I'm sure this one will also be a hell of a book. And I look forward to reading it regardless of what it's about, because I have found you for myself, and I really love your style and love everything that you had to say about just who we are as a society and how you said it. So thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today for our conversations on race and policing and so much more. And I encourage everybody, if you haven't read Hell of a Book, go out and read Hell of a Book. Dr. Murray just put something in the chat about copies being available as part of some kind of lottery that he's running. We'll have to check with the Lottery Commission to make sure we're allowed to do that.
I'll watch my inbox. I wanted to thank especially Jason for signing. I've got 12 copies here, so I'm going to watch my inbox. And I will have copies for the first 12 lucky readers. So please email me there. I've noted that in the chat. Thank you so much, Jason, for signing those for us.
Yeah, thank you. I was glad to do it.
Jason, once again, thank you. Your book was incredible, and I really enjoyed chatting with you today and appreciate your insights on everything. So thank you once again.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you all. Take care.
Thank you.
Conversations on Race and Policing has been supported by funding from the California State University San Bernardino College of Social and Behavioral Sciences, Faux Library, and the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee. Thin Lee is our technical consultant. Pamela Crossan provides administrative support, and Alan Yavor provides communication support. There's more information in the show notes, and please join us online at csusb.edu/CORP for upcoming programming and to find our catalog of over 100 past events with guests like Robin D.G. Kelly, Jabal Bowman, Dorothy Roberts, and many more.